Imagine discovering that everything you know about God is just part of a much larger truth. Behind the image of a loving and gentle creator lies a hidden side, hidden deep in history. This ancient and disturbing secret has the power to completely transform everything you believe in. The very first version of the Bible told a completely different story, a story so powerful, so unsettling, that people have spent centuries trying to bury it. This isn't just some forgotten tale from ancient times. Another version of the Bible existed long before the one we know today. This wasn't filled with the usual stories about parting seas, burning bushes, or commandments carved into stone. Instead, it revealed something much darker and something much more freeing. It spoke of two gods, not one. One God was angry, controlling, and full of wrath. The other was a higher, more loving God, full of mercy and compassion. Jesus didn't come to serve the angry creator God. No, he came to free humanity from him. Sounds impossible, right? But this isn't just some wild theory. It's part of a real ancient debate that rocked the very foundation of Christianity. And at the heart of this revelation is a man named Marcion. Marcion wasn't just another preacher wandering around in the 2nd century. He was a revolutionary, a man who dared to question the very core of what people believed. While others were busy trying to piece together the early Christian faith, Marcion stood up and said something no one else had the courage to say. The God of the Old Testament and the God of Jesus are not the same. He looked at the stories in the Old Testament, the flood that wiped out nearly all of humanity, the plagues that tormented Egypt, the endless wars, the harsh punishments, and he saw a God who was cruel, vengeful, and obsessed with control. But when he read about Jesus, he saw someone preaching love, forgiveness, and compassion. For Marcion, these two couldn't possibly be the same God. So he made a bold claim. The God who created the world was a false God, a harsh ruler who trapped humanity in fear and suffering. Jesus came from a higher God, one who wanted to free us from that fear. But what's even more shocking is how many people believed him. Marcion's teachings spread like wildfire. He gathered followers all over the ancient world, and for a time, his version of Christianity was more popular than the one we know today. The idea of a loving, merciful God who wanted to set them free, not punish them, drew people in. But he didn't stop at just preaching. He wanted to prove his point in a way no one could ignore. So, he created his own version of the Bible, the first Christian Bible ever compiled. But it wasn't the Bible you're familiar with. Marcion's Bible had only 11 books. He carefully selected texts that supported his belief in the higher, loving God and stripped out anything that glorified the cruel creator. He even edited the Gospel of Luke and Paul's letters, cutting out parts that contradicted his message. This was a Bible with a mission to reveal the truth and expose the lie. But the early church leaders weren't about to let that happen. They saw his teachings as a direct threat to their power. If people believed Marcion, the entire foundation of their authority would crumble. So they fought back with everything they had. They called him a heretic. They banned his teachings. They burned his books and hunted down his followers. They did everything they could to erase him from history. And for a while, it worked. Marcion's name faded into the shadows, his ideas buried beneath centuries of church doctrine. Remember to join our community by subscribing to this channel. Centuries later, in the 1970s, archaeologists made a discovery that would reignite the debate Marcion started. They uncovered an ancient text that added fuel to the fire, the Gospel of Judas. But this wasn't just any forgotten scroll. In this gospel, Judas, the man history has painted as the ultimate villain, isn't the traitor we thought he was. Instead, he's the only disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. According to this text, Judas didn't betray Jesus out of greed or evil. He was following Jesus' instructions, helping him reveal the ultimate truth about God. This idea isn't just a wild story, it's a real belief that shook the early days of Christianity to its core. It all started with Marcion. a bold thinker from the 2nd century who dared to say what no one else would. There isn't just one God in the Bible, there are two, and they are nothing alike. According to Marcion, the Creator God, the one from the Old Testament, is a strict, demanding ruler. This God flooded the earth, wiping out almost every living thing because humans disobeyed him. This same God sent plagues to Egypt, ordered the destruction of entire cities, and punished people harshly for breaking his laws. To Marcion, this didn't sound like a loving, kind-hearted being. It sounded like a tyrant, obsessed with power and control. But then there's Jesus. When he read the stories about Jesus, he saw something completely different. Jesus preached about loving your neighbor, forgiving your enemies, and helping the poor and the outcast. He didn't talk about punishment or wrath. Instead, he spoke of mercy, kindness, and a God who cared deeply for people's hearts, not just their actions. For Marcion, this wasn't the same God from the Old Testament. He believed that Jesus came from a higher, greater God, a God of unconditional love and forgiveness. This higher God had nothing to do with the harsh Creator. In fact, Jesus' whole mission, according to him, was to rescue humanity from the control of the Creator God and introduce them to this loving, compassionate, divine being. This is where the idea of duality comes in. He saw the universe as a battleground between two divine forces, one of control and punishment and the other of freedom and love. The Creator God made the physical world full of pain, suffering, and death. But the higher God, the one Jesus represented, was all about the spiritual world, where souls could be free, at peace, and connected to true divinity. This duality wasn't just a small difference of opinion, it flipped everything upside down. If he was right, it meant that the God who created the world wasn't the hero of the story, but the villain. And Jesus wasn't sent by the Creator to save people from their sins. He was sent by the higher God to save people from the Creator's grip. This idea was explosive. It wasn't just about theology, it was about freedom. If people believed Marcion, they would stop fearing the angry God of the Old Testament. They would realize that they weren't trapped by rules and punishments, but were loved unconditionally by a higher, more compassionate divine being. This kind of thinking threatened the early church's authority, which relied heavily on teaching people to fear God's wrath and obey his laws. But he wasn't the only one who believed in this divine duality. Gnostic groups, early Christian communities with their own unique beliefs, also saw the world in a similar way. They believed that the material world was a flawed creation made by an inferior false god known as Yaldabaoth. This god was ignorant and corrupt, trapping souls in a world of suffering. But beyond Yaldabaoth was the true God, a being of pure light and love, far removed from the messy, painful world we live in. This is the heart of the story behind Marcion and the ancient movement he sparked. He didn't just challenge religious ideas, he led a full-blown rebellion against the system that had kept people living in fear for generations. His message wasn't just about theology, it was about liberation. It was about breaking the chains of fear and discovering a deeper, freer connection to the divine. Let's rewind to the 2nd century. The Christian faith was still in its infancy, struggling to define itself. The stories of Jesus were being passed around, and different groups were debating what it all meant. But most people agreed on one thing: the God of the Old Testament, the one who created the world and gave the 10 Commandments, was the same God Jesus talked about. But he saw things differently. He looked at the Old Testament stories, floods that destroyed nearly everyone, plagues that devastated nations, wars commanded by God himself, and he saw a deity obsessed with power and punishment. To him, this couldn't be the same God that Jesus spoke of. Jesus preached love, forgiveness, and mercy, values that didn't match the harsh, judgmental God of ancient scriptures. His message was simple but radical. The God of Jesus is not the Creator God. Jesus came not to serve the old God, but to oppose him. He wasn't here to reinforce the old rules, he was here to smash them. This idea was like lighting a match in a room full of dynamite. It didn't just challenge religious beliefs, it threatened to tear down the entire structure of the early church. For centuries, religion had been used as a tool of control. Fear of divine punishment kept people in line. The idea that you had to obey God's harsh rules or suffer eternal consequences was powerful. It made people obedient, submissive, and easy to govern. But he flipped this script. He told people that they didn't need to fear the Creator God because he wasn't the true God. Instead, there was a higher, more loving divine being who wanted to liberate them from this fear. This was more than just a theological argument. It was a call to rebellion. His followers weren't just adopting new ideas. They were stepping into a new way of life, one that rejected the oppressive systems of the past. They no longer feared divine wrath. They no longer felt bound by rigid rules. Instead, they embraced a God of freedom and love, one who wanted them to live fully and joyfully without the weight of constant guilt and fear. But rebellion comes at a price. The early church leaders saw Marcion's ideas as a direct threat to their authority. If people stopped fearing the angry God of the Old Testament, they'd stop following the church's rules. The leaders didn't just disagree with Marcion, they attacked him. They called him a heretic, burned his writings, and excommunicated his followers. They did everything they could to erase his message, but the spark of rebellion had already been lit. His movement wasn't just about theology, it had real-world consequences. His followers, known as Marcionites, lived out their beliefs in bold, radical ways. Are you enjoying the story? Support our channel by clicking the subscribe button. They rejected many of the social norms of their time, including the idea that only men could lead. In Marcionite communities, women held positions of power, defying the patriarchal systems that dominated the ancient world. They also practiced strict nonviolence, refusing to participate in wars or violent conflicts, no matter what the authorities demanded. Even their diets reflected their rebellion. While most people at the time ate meat, the Marcionites adopted a fish-based diet as a symbol of spiritual purity. This wasn't just about food. It was a protest against the deaths and violence they saw. Every part of their lives reflected their belief in a higher, more compassionate God who valued peace and freedom over control and punishment. Fast forward to today, and you'll see that these ancient ideas haven't disappeared. They've found new life in modern spiritual movements that emphasize personal freedom, inner truth, and the rejection of fear-based beliefs. People are waking up to the idea that spirituality isn't about following strict rules or fearing punishment. It's about discovering the divine within themselves and living authentically. These ideas are still dangerous to those in power. Fear-based systems are resistant to challenge. That's why his teachings were suppressed for so long. That's why Gnostic texts were hidden away, labeled as heresy and almost lost to history. People become uncontrollable when they cease to live in fear. They begin to think independently, challenge authority, and pursue truth that goes beyond the narratives they've heard. While Marcion's ideas may have been suppressed by early church leaders, his message of liberation from a fear-based faith is more relevant today than ever. Across the globe, people are stepping away from traditional religious institutions, seeking personal connections with the divine that don't rely on fear, guilt, or rigid rules. This shift isn't just a coincidence, it's the modern manifestation of a rebellion that started centuries ago. Let's start by looking at the decline of organized religion. In many countries, attendance in churches, mosques, and temples is shrinking. More and more people identify as spiritual but not religious. They're leaving behind doctrines that emphasize sin, punishment, and the wrath of God because they're tired of being told that they're inherently flawed, that they need to fear divine judgment, or that salvation comes only through strict obedience to rules set by human authorities. Instead, people are embracing spirituality as a personal journey, one focused on love, inner growth, and self-discovery. This mirrors his belief in a higher, benevolent God who isn't concerned with controlling humanity through fear, but instead offers unconditional love and freedom. Modern spiritual seekers are rejecting the idea of a punishing creator and reconnecting with the concept of a compassionate, nurturing divine force, just as he taught nearly 2,000 years ago. Meditation and mindfulness practices provide a clear example of this shift. These aren't just trendy wellness habits. They're spiritual practices rooted in the belief that divinity isn't something external to be feared, but something internal to be discovered. When people sit in silence, focusing on their breath or connecting with the present moment, they're tuning into that same inner truth that the Gnostics believed in. According to Gnostic teachings, the true God resides not in the heavens above, but within each individual, waiting to be uncovered through introspection and awareness. Similarly, movements like New Thought and non-dualism echo these ancient ideas. New Thought teaches that the universe is an abundant, loving force and that human beings can shape their reality through positive thinking and alignment with divine principles. Non-dualism, on the other hand, emphasizes the unity of all existence, erasing the boundaries between the divine and the human. Both philosophies reflect Marcion's and the Gnostics' belief that the divine is not a distant, controlling entity, but a loving presence that exists within and around us. Even modern science is catching up with these ideas. The rise of quantum spirituality, where people explore the connection between consciousness and the universe, resonates with the ancient belief that the material world is only a small part of a much larger, more mysterious reality. Quantum theories suggest that everything is interconnected, blurring the lines between the physical and the spiritual. This aligns with the Gnostic view that the material world, created by an inferior god, is just a shadow of the true divine reality beyond it. But this isn't just about personal spirituality. The ideas that Marcion and the Gnostics introduced also challenge systems of power and control. Throughout history, religion has often been used as a tool to manipulate and dominate. Fear of hell, divine punishment, and eternal damnation has been wielded to keep people obedient, not just to God, but to rulers, governments, and religious authorities. The idea that God is an angry judge who demands obedience is losing its grip. Instead, individuals are reclaiming their spiritual autonomy, recognizing that they don't need to fear divine wrath to live meaningful, ethical lives. This mirrors the Marcionite rebellion against the early church's use of fear to maintain power. Just as Marcion challenged the religious authorities of his time, modern spiritual movements are challenging the institutions that have long dictated what people should believe. One example of this shift is the rise of progressive religious movements. These communities embrace values like inclusivity, equality, and social justice, rejecting traditional interpretations of Scripture that promote exclusion, judgment, or oppression. For instance, many modern Christian groups openly support LGBTQ+ rights, gender equality, and environmental stewardship, focusing on the teachings of Jesus that emphasize love and compassion rather than punishment and fear. This reflects Marcion's belief that the true message of Jesus was about liberation and unconditional love, not about enforcing rigid rules or condemning others. Even in political activism, we see echoes of these ancient ideas. Movements that fight against systemic oppression, whether it's racial injustice, economic inequality, or environmental destruction, often draw on spiritual principles that emphasize the divine value of every individual and the interconnectedness of all life. These movements challenge the same systems of control that Marcion and the Gnostics opposed. Systems that rely on fear, division, and dominance to maintain. This isn't just a tale from ancient history. It's a story about freedom, about the courage to question the narratives that have been handed down for generations. It's about a man named Marcion, a group known as the Gnostics, and a gospel written by Judas, all of whom dared to challenge the status quo. Their teachings were buried, their ideas labeled heretical, and their names nearly forgotten. But the truths they uncovered refused to stay hidden. At the heart of their message is a radical idea: the God of fear, punishment, and control, the God who floods the earth, rains plagues on Egypt, and demands strict obedience, is not the same God that Jesus spoke of. According to Marcion and the Gnostics, there is a higher, more loving God who wants to free humanity from the chains of fear and guilt. This God doesn't demand sacrifices or blind obedience. Instead, this divine force offers unconditional love and spiritual liberation. This idea wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. If people believed Marcion, they would cease to fear the God of the Old Testament. Religious authorities' rules and rituals would no longer bind them. They would realize that they were already free, already connected to a divine source of love and compassion. Marcion's ideas faced suppression precisely for this reason. The early church couldn't afford to let people believe that they didn't need intermediaries, priests, bishops, or churches to connect with the divine. They couldn't risk losing the power that came from controlling spiritual stories. Consequently, they declared Marcion a heretic. The authorities excommunicated his followers. They set fire to his writings. The same fate awaited the Gnostics, whose texts, like the Gospel of Judas, were hidden away, buried in the sands of time. Centuries later, these ancient texts were unearthed, and with them came a renewed understanding of what it means to be spiritual. The message of rebellion and liberation that Marcion and the Gnostics preached thousands of years ago is now resonating in the hearts and minds of people around the world. It's not just about challenging religious doctrines, it's about redefining the very foundation of faith. In today's world, more and more people are walking away from traditional religious institutions. They're tired of being told that they're inherently sinful, that they need to fear divine punishment, and that salvation is something they have to earn. Instead, they're embracing spirituality as a personal journey, one that focuses on inner growth, love, and a direct connection to the divine. This shift isn't a coincidence. It's the modern continuation of the ancient rebellion that he started. People are realizing that they don't need to live under the shadow of fear. They're discovering that the divine isn't a distant, wrathful ruler, but a loving presence that exists within them. They're waking up to the idea that spiritual freedom isn't something you achieve by following rules. It's something you already have. Take a look around and you'll see echoes of these ancient ideas everywhere. Mindfulness and meditation practices are helping people connect with their inner selves and find peace without relying on external religious structures. If you're enjoying this journey, consider supporting this content by giving a super thanks. By contributing, you'll be helping us make more content like this. New Thought movements teach that the universe is an abundant, loving force and that we have the power to shape our own realities. Non-dualism breaks down the barriers between the divine and the human, emphasizing that we are all part of a greater, unified existence. But this isn't just about personal spirituality. The message conveyed by him and the Gnostics carries significant social and political implications. People have used religion as a tool of control for centuries. Fear of divine punishment has justified wars, oppression, and the suppression of dissent. It has been used to keep people obedient to rulers, governments, and religious authorities. But when people realize that they don't need to fear a wrathful God, they become harder to control. They start questioning the systems that have kept them in line. They begin to see that true freedom, both spiritual and societal, comes from rejecting fear and embracing love. But with this freedom comes a choice. You can continue to accept the stories you've been told, living under the weight of fear and guilt. Or you can step into a new understanding, one that liberates you from the chains of control and connects you to a deeper, more authentic spirituality. Thanks for watching. Join our community by subscribing to this channel. Until the next video.